China's Mao Zedong and Richard Nixon forge a new era with one handshake. Their hour-long discussion was a leap into the unknown after decades of hostility.
It was a huge gamble by both sides, particularly by the President of the United States, who went to the capital of a state that we didn't recognize.
The US had isolated China since Mao's Communist Revolution and the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Now renowned anti-communist Richard Nixon wanted to reverse course by reaching out to him. It was a big shock.
We must recognize that the government of the People's Republic of China and the government of the United States have had great differences. We will have differences in the future. But what we must do is to find a way to see that we can have differences without being enemies in war.
Chas Freeman was Nixon's lead interpreter for the week-long visit.
This was an entirely novel experience for both sides. There were a lot of people in China who did not favor this opening. There was a great deal of tension. There were, for example, military men who had fought against us in Korea, some who had lost their sons in Korea. On the other hand, Chinese and Americans find easy rapport. We get along. We don't have the same sense of humor, but we both have a sense of humor. And it was a convivial occasion, despite the tension.
Mao and Nixon avoided controversial topics in their meeting. Instead, the US did the hard talk with Prime Minister Zhou Enlai, as both sides worked on a communique setting out their respective positions on a range of issues where they disagreed. It wasn't easy.
The purpose of that was to reassure allies on both sides that we weren't selling them out. The Chinese had to convince the North Koreans, we had to convince the South Koreans, and the same with the North and the South Vietnamese. So those discussions were very rancorous.
Their work finally done, Nixon offered his hosts a last toast.
This was the week that changed the world.
When that week was over and you got back on board the plane to fly back to Washington, what went through your mind? What was the mood like?
Well, I think I, like everyone else, was elated. This had been a great success. It was a diplomatic feat of considerable difficulty.
And yet this diplomatic breakthrough was soon overshadowed by problems back home.
Almost exactly 4 months after meeting Mao, Nixon's downfall began here at the Watergate complex in Washington. Members of his own staff burgled their Democratic opponents to spy on them in the run-up to the election.
Facing impeachment for trying to cover up the conspiracy,
Well, I'm not a crook.
Nixon became the first US president to resign in office. Nevertheless, Mao and Nixon had carved a path for successive leaders from both sides to build on that relationship. Their interconnected economies now account for nearly 40% of the world's total output. But new US President Donald Trump's anti-Chinese comments have left some wondering where that relationship is heading.
Well, I think now the stakes of a breakdown in the US-China relationship are much higher because you have a much deeper economic relationship and a much more even military balance between the two. And I think that as both countries go forward in their relations, they need to be aware of what each side could do to the other in the event of a problem spiraling out of control.
On the Chinese side, there is a mood of nationalism, assertiveness, a pride in China's return to wealth and power, and less willingness to compromise than in the past. So the relationship is in a delicate moment.
Perhaps more reason than ever to draw lessons from the past. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.